Welcome to this lesson where we're going to talk about components. So we just talked about buttons, and buttons aren't that exciting, but now we're going to talk about cards. And then in a little bit, we're going to get into a challenge where we can kind of combine cards and buttons, and we put your skills to the test. So what is a card in terms of a UI component? Basically, it's just a visual encapsulation of information, and usually it's information that might be repeated in some different way. So you usually have multiple cards in a user interface. So cards can be used from anything from like different testimonials, like one person's testimonials here in a card, another person's here, or they could be not in just rows or columns, they can be in columns conversely. And I'll show that concept as well. And cards can be very simple. They can sometimes only include just a title and a description and maybe an exit button, or they can also be contained with a lot of other information. They can have a thumbnail. Maybe it's like an article with a title, a date, a description, and also maybe a couple buttons. So they can be, quite complex or very simple. It doesn't matter in the end though, as long as you're applying those UI design fundamentals for all of them. So let's take a look at different types of cards and how we can design them, especially in terms of integrating them into layouts. So instead of just dealing with a white background, let's just change things up, and we're just going to choose a kind of like a darker background here. And let's get started with a really simple version of a card. So we're going to go ahead and take our type, and I'm going to type in shop women's shoes. All right, so let's make sure we can see this. So we're going to make it white. And I'm just using pop-ins here, and I think this time we're going to increase the size a bit and also make it bold, because we're going to also have a description underneath it. So I want to have 4 different cards all in 4 different columns next to each other. Now I'm not happy with the leading here. It's kind of high. Leading, remember, is the line height between the lines of text. And so we can just take this where it says auto, and we can hit the down arrow key, right there, right about there. So next we'll duplicate that, which is going to be Control D. Just move it down, holding Shift and left clicking and dragging. And then this time maybe we'll just use 18, and we will also use regular. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and copy off screen just some type here. And now initially this was white, so I'll change that here in a second. We can go down to 16 here. All right, so now there's good visual hierarchy between these two elements. We can increase the visual hierarchy, not just through font weight and scale or the font size, but also through color. And so one great way to do that is just to take a look at the background, and we can come over here with this eyedropper tool, make it the same exact color. In this case, it's just a dark gray, and we can come up right there. Again, make sure you get out your stark contrast checker to make sure that it's still readable. And we can also bring this down, the line height as well, because it's not as large of a font up here. Okay, so next up, we're going to also, for these examples, I'm going to have a photograph. So I'm going to take the rectangle tool, just left click and drag somewhere right around there. Then we're going to come over here. I want you to go to plugins, browse plugins in community, and I want you to search for the Unsplash plugin, UNSPLACH. And when you do that and you have it installed, we can now search for different free to use images. So for this one, let's just type in shoe. All right, and maybe we'll just choose this one right here. All right, great. So now this here is a card. It's an extremely simple card, even though it doesn't have a container around it. We could just tell based on how it's been designed with the alignment and scale and justification that this is a card. And if we go ahead and we duplicate this, Control D, hold Shift, move it over, give it a little bit of white space between, and hit Control D again and then Control D again, we can now see that these are essentially 4 different cards or blips of information essentially. Now let's go ahead and create another variation of a card, and one that's more typical of what you would see. Most cards have their own defined container inside of them. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and close that out, and we're going to take the rectangle tool and we're just going to wrap it around here. All right, so now we'll take this, align it to the back, and a lot of times there's two different ways to approach card design when it comes to the background of the card container itself. We can take the background itself and then just apply a tint slightly, making it slightly lighter than the background it's on. Sometimes you can go shade and make it slightly darker, so that's also an option. We're just going to go slightly lighter. And then when you do that, there's not much white space between the text right now and the outer sides, so you don't want that. What we want to do is we want to make sure that this is significantly smaller in terms of size. So we can probably scale this down to 22 at least. And notice how I'm moving it in. And another thing we can do, by the way, before we get to that part, is we could take this image, hold Alt, and then also drag it all the way up. So now we can move this into place a little bit better. And we want to make sure everything is lined up. Remember, use your guides. All right, so in my opinion, I think we probably need to come down in size a little bit here. And then also adjust the line height here. Put this right here. And I'm adjusting the leading a little bit here. And we'll get this all evened up. All right, so here's a really simple example of a card that has a container behind it that doesn't really contrast very much with the background, which is okay because the container background itself isn't like a piece of type that somebody needs to read necessarily. So now we can go ahead and duplicate this, put it here, and duplicate it a couple more times, and get this all centered up. All right, so now we have two different card containers, two different types rather. One that's completely just transparent, and then another one here that has a subtle background. Now we can also take the opposite approach of this, and we can create a card container that has a high contrast background, and we'll make it white. So then you'll see it will affect the type itself, and then we'll have to make adjustments to that type color to make sure that there's good contrast. So we can bump this all the way up to white. Now we can take these two and make them black. And you see where it says selection colors, you have to change both of them because they were slightly different. All right. So now we can further increase the visual hierarchy by kind of bring this up just a bit in terms of reducing the contrast. And there we go with that one. Again, very simple stuff happening here. Could probably increase this. There's probably not enough equal white space. So even when I'm designing like freestyle like this, one thing that I just noticed, if we hold Alt right here, 16 pixels, but right here, it would be probably about 25. Make sure everything is consistently applied in terms of your white space. So now let's go ahead back and fix that. And again, we'll fix this. So notice how easy it is to kind of, when you're eyeballing stuff, to have things get screwed up like that. All right. So now we could take this, we'll duplicate it. And again, another card type. And you might be wondering, how do I know which one exactly I should use? Well, a lot of this is subjective preferences, but whatever you do use, make sure you're using it in a way that's consistent throughout the entire site or app. All right, let's do yet another one. And just like a button, how you can have an outlined button that doesn't have a fill, we can also do the same thing right here. So let's delete this. And this time we'll get rid of the fill. We'll add a stroke right here. And we'll come up. And one thing you don't want to do is this. So let me make the text, both the text white here. We'll take this option right here and maybe just come up right around there. You don't want to do this with borders because that's a high contrast border and it just it distracts the user from the content that's important. So what you want to do is, if you're going to use a border, make sure you drop down the opacity. So I'm dropping it down with my keyboard down arrow key, and right there would be perfectly fine. So now we can take this and duplicate it. And then we'll get these all even up. And there we go. So you can see there's a lot of different ways to style a card. And this is obviously a pretty simple card. It just has a headline, a subheadline, or a description rather, and just a thumbnail. And then also you have different options in terms of how you lay those cards out. So for instance, we could also choose, instead of stacking these in actual columns like this, we can do a row orientation. So you could call this portrait, and then we can do a landscape version as well. So let's take, for instance, this one. We'll just duplicate that. We're gonna drag this here to the top, and I'll get rid of some of these. And now let's go ahead and just take this. We're gonna put it right here, get this lined up, and we're gonna put this one right here. This time we'll just drag this up because we're gonna have more space. We'll drag this out. And again, make sure you have good white space all around. I don't want to see people doing things like this. Just not enough space. Make sure it has room to breathe. That's the white space, the inner padding of your containers. And this here looks pretty solid, just, you know, as it is itself. So now we can go ahead and we can Control D to duplicate, move these over, Control D to duplicate all those, move those over, Control G to group and center horizontally and vertically. And there we go. Very, very, very simple. Now I also want to show you a real cool feature of Figma, which is worth introducing now, called components. All right, so let me back up. All right, so what we'll do here is we're gonna take all this, right click and choose create component. So now it's outlined in this purple. And if we duplicate this, we create an instance of the component. If we come back to this original component and we make some sort of change, it's going to be reflected in all the other ones. So let me do another duplicate here. So if we decided to change this background color, and we change the fill here to, let's go like the blue, notice how they're all changing. So components are really powerful and useful for when you get to the point where you're designing a full layout and you have different instances of your components. All right, so let me go ahead and just duplicate that. So in short, when it comes to card designs, like I said, it's just encapsulating data in a form in which it usually repeats, and it also helps condense information and give it context within being contained in a singular container or unit, so to speak. And so there's a lot of different use cases for cards, which we're going to see. Now we're going to do a few tests, and then we're going to do a challenge that requires you to create a card along with a call to action inside of the card container itself. So hopefully you're starting to understand how really all of this ties back to UI design fundamentals and how it's going to guide all of your decisions.